Welcome to this in-depth study of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I'm Diana Waring, and together we're going to go on a journey to each of these 7 wonders, and we're going to find out what made them so spectacular and some amazing little stories about each of them. Now, have you ever heard of or seen pictures of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? If you've seen pictures, they're probably, most of them, artists' renditions, because only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still stands today. Have you ever wondered what made them so great or how they came into being? And if you've ever listened to any of my other recordings, you might be wondering, how on earth will Diana connect these historic monuments with what God is doing in history? Well, let's take a look. The 7 wonders of the ancient world. These incredible man-made marvels. You know, they astonished Greek travelers in ancient times. And in fact, it was Greek travelers that were wandering around through the known world of that time who decided, wow, these are so amazing. Let's call them the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They probably didn't say ancient world, but anyway, they said these are the 7 wonders of our time. And these 7 wonders continue to astonish us today, though, as I mentioned, only one remains in existence. When were they built? Why were they built? Who built them? What was their purpose? Where were they built? I mean, where are these places like Halicarnassus, for heaven's sakes? When were they destroyed and how did they function? We're going to have sort of a who, what, where, when, why, and how on this 7 Wonders audio recording. And we're going to look at some amazing things. Now, for a sneak preview, do you know why the Great Pyramid no longer looks white? When it was first constructed, it was a brilliant, gleaming white. It was so brilliant, in fact, that it could be seen miles off. It was just an amazing feat. And we're going to look at these amazing engineering accomplishments of the ancient Egyptians who built these Great Pyramids. We still don't know how they were built. We still have no clue how the mathematically precise arrangements of these massive, huge heaps of stones were put together. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to look at the incredible 1 in 5 billion chance of the biblical prophecies being fulfilled concerning the city of Babylon, where one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was located, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Did you know that the Bible has a lot to say about this city? It actually contains many prophecies about Babylon, and we're going to look to see how accurately the city's history was foretold, that 1 in 5 billion statistic I just mentioned. We're also going to look at the dual function of the Greek city of Olympia, where the statue of Zeus was located in ancient Greece. We're going to find out about how the curtain from the temple in Jerusalem, you know, the one that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, how that may have actually ended up in Olympia at the statue in the temple of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We're also going to look at the adventures of the Apostle Paul in Ephesus concerning another one of the ancient wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis, or the Temple of Diana. It was known by both names. And we're going to look at how Alexander the Great offered to pay for the temple to be completed. Did you know that Alexander the Great was involved in that one? We're also going to look at the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. And the test at the end of the audio recording is, can you say Halicarnassus? Can you say quickly the mausoleum at Halicarnassus? Anyway, it's another one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Why it lasted longer than the city itself, and how parts of the mausoleum came to be found in a castle after the Crusades in the Middle Ages. We're going to find out why the people of Rhodes built the Colossus, another one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. The Colossus, it was so similar to our Statue of Liberty in the United States in its height and its appearance. We're going to look at that and why the people built it and who shipped it off in pieces to be used as lamps and trays. That's an amazing little story. Finally, we're going to look at the amazing design of the ancient city of Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria, the capital city of Alexander the Great. It was built for him, though he never got to live there. He was actually buried there, but that's another story. We're going to look at Alexandria, where the final wonder of the ancient world, the Pharos, or the lighthouse, was built. And we're going to discover how the body of Mark the evangelist, that's the writer of the Gospel of Mark, how his body was actually stolen out of the city of Alexandria. Another amazing story. So, is your interest piqued? Well, here we go. The Great Pyramid of Egypt, the one that was built for the pharaoh Cheops. That's the Greek word, or now they say Khufu. It was built about 2000 BC. That's 4,000 years ago. That means it was old when those Greek guys wandering around in ancient Greece, when they saw it in Egypt, they thought it was really old at the time they saw it. And it's the only ancient wonder of the world that's still intact. I thought that was fascinating. It was incredibly built with incredible precision in its size and in its angles. And so that's what we want to talk about for a minute and how it was built. It was 756 feet in length along each side. Now there are 4 sides and they're all 756 feet. They're not exactly, but the difference between the longest side and the shortest side, there's only a 7.9 inch difference. So these huge, massive blocks that were used in this huge building, they're only off by a little over 7 inches in their sides. It is 450 feet tall. It used to be 30 feet taller, but in the Middle Ages, the Arabs that were there took the top stones and took them to use in buildings near Cairo. They decided it was too hard to transport them, so they quit doing that, but it was taller than it is today. There are 2,300,000 blocks of stone used in the pyramids, each one averaging 2.5 tons in weight. That's a lot. 2.5 tons. That was the average. The biggest blocks weighed 15 tons. So this is a huge building made of huge stones that weigh a whole lot, and yet they got them in these precision arrangements. And we'll talk about that as we go on here. When Napoleon went to Egypt in 1798, he looked at the pyramids, and it's amazing to me that he was able to correctly calculate that the Great Pyramid and the other 2 ones that are just a little bit smaller, sitting right there with it, they had enough stone in them to build a wall 10 feet high and 1 foot wide all the way around France. This is huge. That's why they called it a wonder of the world. It was seen by Herodotus in the 400s BC. Now, Herodotus was an ancient Greek historian, kind of a world traveler, and he wrote about the things that he saw. When he was in Egypt, he saw it, and he described it like this. He said it was gleaming white because it was covered with white limestone blocks. They were smooth and fine. It made the pyramid flat. Instead of having this stair step kind of a look that today it has those stairs. In fact, tourists used to climb the stairs going up the pyramids, and then they'd fall off and die. And so the government said, no more of that. In the 400s, when Herodotus saw this, it was absolutely flat. It was steep. The sides were flat. It was amazing. The limestone was also, unfortunately, used by the Arabs in their buildings, but the top 100 feet of the limestone remains on a neighboring pyramid. And there were some at the base of the Great Pyramid, and that gave rise to some interesting understandings about how incredibly accurate these ancient Egyptians were as they built this pyramid. Reading from a book called The 7 Wonders of the Ancient World by Robert Silverberg, an excellent book on this topic, he wrote that the accuracy with which the limestone blocks of casing were put in place is one of the reasons why the Great Pyramid was deemed a wonder of the world. The British archaeologist William Matthews Flinders Petrie, who examined the remaining casing at the base of the Great Pyramid in 1881, found that the stone blocks had been cut so carefully that the average distance between them was only 1/50th of an inch, and in places they were as close as 1/500th of an inch. We're talking very close together, okay? The builders then had managed to fill the microscopic space between the stones with cement. How did they do it? Well, no one has a clue. And actually, when people write about this ancient wonder of the world, they say it's not easy to understand how these relatively primitive people were able to produce such startling results. If you remember my perspective on ancient man, they had so much going for them. They were closer to the beginning of creation. They used more of their brains. They had all kinds of technological abilities that we don't know about. And so here it is. The Great Pyramid of Cheops is one of those enigmas of ancient man that we who believe the Bible is true understand how this came about. Now, what was it? The Great Pyramid was just a great big tomb for the pharaoh Cheops. He had it built while he waited to die. They had a different look at, tombs and building tombs in those days. And he said, I got to have this built and finished before I die, because this is going to be the place that gets me into the next world, and I'll have all these great things with me. And so it was a build them while you wait kind of a process. When he died, they began doing the mummification of the body, which took a long time. And then he was entombed, and they went through the big ceremonies, and they had all the gold and everything that they put in the tombs. Look at King Tutankhamun if you want to understand what kind of things they put in there. And he was signed, sealed, and buried in this great big tomb. But a long time ago, in ancient history, sometime, grave robbers broke in and stole everything, even the body. All that's left now is the tomb, which is one of the ancient wonders of the world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are absolutely fascinating, because not only were they an ancient wonder of the world, but they were part of one of the greatest cities of the world in that time period. And the Bible has something to say about this city. If we look at Isaiah chapter 13, verses 19 to 22, it says, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will the shepherds make their sheepfolds there, but wild beasts of the desert will lie there." And it goes on and talks about all the critters that are going to be, wild critters that are going to be there. And then it says, "Her time is near to come, and her days will not be prolonged." Now, we want to turn over to Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 26. This is another biblical prophecy about the destruction of Babylon and what's going to happen. And it says in verse 26, "They shall not take from you a stone for a corner, nor a stone for a foundation, but you shall be desolate forever, says the Lord." And finally, Jeremiah 51:43, it says, "Her cities are a desolation, a dry land and a wilderness, a land where no one dwells, through which no son of man passes." Amazing. The Bible gives 7 different indications, biblical, prophetic indications of what will happen in the great city of Babylon. And we find that every single one of them has come to pass. Going real quickly through the 7 again, if you missed them as I was reading. Number 1, it'll be destroyed. Number 2, it will never be re-inhabited. Now, often cities are destroyed, but they're usually built up again and people live there. They choose these places for a reason, but no one ever went back to live in Babylon again. Number 3, Arabs will not pitch their tents there. Number 4, no sheepfolds, no place for the sheep to hang out. Number 5, wild beasts will occupy the ruins. Number 6, stones will not be removed for other buildings. And that is pretty wild, because in that area of the world, stones were really quite special. In fact, they imported the stones that they used in the city of Babylon. They didn't use very many. Mostly it was bricks that they made right there on the spot. Lots and lots of bricks. But the stones that they had brought in, they left there. They didn't take them and use them for any other building, any other city. They were left there. That's very unusual in archaeology. Number 7, men will not pass by the ruins. Well, for all of time, from the time when Babylon was really deserted, it has never been on the top 10 lists of where tourists want to go. And so still, even today, men do not pass by the ruins. Now, according to the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, he says there's an unbelievable 1 in 5 billion chance that all 7 of those prophecies would come true. And they did. So the walls of Babylon were actually up for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was included in a number of the lists, and eventually it fell off the side, and they made room for the lighthouse at Alexandria, which we'll talk about last. It was in the land between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was the mightiest city in the world in its day. But as we mentioned, it was prophesied by Jeremiah that it would fall. And the last time that it fell. It was never rebuilt. The first city of Babylon was in the 1700s BC when Hammurabi, if you're familiar with him at all, he's the guy that figured out a new code of laws. It's very famous. If you start looking in old times, they're always talking about Hammurabi. Well, he was over the first city of Babylon in the 1700s BC. And during the reign of Sennacherib of Assyria, Babylon rebelled against Assyria, and Sennacherib destroyed the city in around the 690s BC, but it was rebuilt again in the 680s. Okay, it's back again. In 607 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, good old King Neb, he really built up the city of Babylon. He ruled for 43 years. He built those giant walls and the avenues and the palaces and the temples, and we believe that he was the one that built the Hanging Gardens. Now in 539 BC, Babylon was captured by Cyrus, king of Persia. 482 BC, Babylon revolted, and the Persians didn't like it. Of course, people get uptight about when you revolt. And so they partly destroyed the city. By 6th century AD, it was lived in only by peasants in huts. And by the 13th century, it was totally abandoned. No one lived there after the 13th century AD. Now, when Herodotus saw it in 450 BC, this guy got around, okay? He wrote this: in addition to its size, Babylon surpasses in splendor any city in the known world. He claimed that the fabulous wall surrounding Babylon was 56 miles in length. 56, this is a big city, okay? 80 feet thick. The walls were 80 feet thick, and they were 320 feet high. He said there was room on top for a 4-horse chariot to turn, and that 100 bronze gates were set in this mammoth wall. But that was only the outer wall. Within it, he said there was a second inner wall, though it's not as thick as the first, but it was still as strong. And he told of fortresses inside the city and temples with immense statues of solid gold and all kinds of spectacular features. He did not talk about the Hanging Gardens, which is interesting. We have to get our information from other people who saw it. Now, the Greek word for the Hanging Gardens is kremastos. Perhaps it's better translated as overhanging. You know, we think of the Hanging Gardens. What do they hang from? You know, do they have ropes up in the sky or something where they do it? Perhaps it means overhanging, like a terrace garden. It was a roof garden high above the city that Nebuchadnezzar built for his wife, who was the daughter of the king of the Medes, who she was from, well, the area of the Medes. They had all these beautiful mountains, and it was green and beautiful, and now you're living on the plains of Shinar and Babylon. It's dry and dusty, and it just doesn't look the same. And so she was homesick. And he said, okay, one artificial mountain with green growing things coming right up. According to ancient writers, they said that the Hanging Gardens were equal in height to the walls of the town. So that'd be 320 feet in height. And their numerous lofty trees afforded a grateful shade. The trees were 12 feet in circumference and 50 feet in height. Supporting these are 20 thick walls, 11 feet distant from each other. Now, do you understand? They were describing very specific things to look for. They said there was a range of stone arches over which was extended a 4-sided pavement of stone strong enough to bear earth piled high and water supplied for irrigation. And then this person who saw it a long time ago said, a distant spectator of these groves would suppose them to be woods, nodding on the mountains. Okay, a German archaeologist in 1899, a man by the name of Robert Kohldavi, first found the walls of Babylon. And then he verified much of what Herodotus said. He said, you know what? They really were 80 feet thick. They really were 320 feet high. He wasn't sure if they were 56 miles long, but he said, this guy, Herodotus, was pretty accurate. Then next, Robert Kohldavi found the base of the great ziggurat of Babylon. Then he found the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and he believed that he found the Hanging Gardens at the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, reading again from that book by Robert Silverberg, he said, while working in the southern citadel one day, not far from the royal palace, Kohldavi came upon a brick staircase leading into a sort of basement. In the cellar, he discovered 14 large rooms whose ceilings were arches of stone. The use of stone at once struck Kohldavi as unusual, for stone was scarce in this part of Mesopotamia, and hardly any had been employed in the construction of the rest of the city. In all ancient descriptions of Babylon, only 2 buildings
were said to have been even partly made of stone. These were the northern citadel, said to have had stone in its north wall, and the Hanging Gardens. Kohldavi had already excavated the north wall of the northern citadel, which did indeed contain large quantities of stone. Now he found a second stone building. Were these underground arch rooms the basement of the Hanging Gardens? Well, I don't know. I'm all in suspense. What happened? Well, he starts reading all these ancient guys and looking for what they said and how they described it. And he refused to jump to the conclusion that he had actually found the Hanging Gardens. He continued to dig. He wanted proof positive, and he found it. In one of the western rooms, he found a well. He said, it was a well which differs from all other wells known either in Babylon or elsewhere in the ancient world. This is a unique well, okay? It has 3 shafts placed close to each other, a square one in the center and oblong ones on each side, if you can picture that. An arrangement which he said, I can see no other explanation than that a mechanical hydraulic machine stood here, which worked on the same principle as our chain pump, with buckets attached to bring the water up continuously. He said this is how they were able to do it. So a flourishing, huge garden, seemingly hanging at the top of the city, fed water from the Euphrates by these mechanical engines. That was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Colossus of Rhodes. Now, where is Rhodes? It's an island off the southwestern tip of Asia Minor. Look again on your map, where the Aegean Sea meets the Mediterranean. Now, we find out in Acts 21, verse 1, that Paul, in a sailing ship, sailed by Rhodes. Did he see the Colossus? That was my first question when I read that. I went, wow, was he close enough? Did he see any of the Colossus of Rhodes? That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? What was the Colossus of Rhodes? Well, it was a gigantic, actually, statue of Helios. That was the Greek sun god that the people in Rhodes felt was their special protector. Well, what did he protect them from? After Alexander the Great died, Rhodes threw off the Macedonian rulers that had control over the island of Rhodes. They said, no, we want to be independent. We don't want any of these guys ruling over us, and they joined in support of Ptolemy in Egypt. And that was good commercially for them. They had a good commercial enterprise going on with Ptolemy. But that made the king of Macedon, who was also one of Alexander the Great's generals, see, both Ptolemy and Antigonus of Macedon, they were both generals under Alexander the Great. When they sided with Ptolemy, when the Rhodes people sided with Ptolemy, Antigonus of Macedon got really angry, so he tried to capture the city in 307 BC. For 1 year, he had this incredible, terrible siege against the city, and finally Ptolemy heard about it. He sent a fleet to lift the siege. It was a pretty brutal time, but when the siege was lifted, they were so grateful that they said, well, we got to do something. We got to build a statue, not of Ptolemy, because to the people's minds at that time, that would have been idolatry. So they made one of their god, the sun god that they felt like had rescued them at that time. Pliny, again, that Roman historian guy who died when Mount Vesuvius erupted, he said it took 12 years to complete building. It was begun in 304 BC, finished in 292 BC, and it cost $5 million in modern day money. It stood only 56 years. Let's see, if we start dividing 5 million into 56 years, it was a pretty expensive statue for a short time. It was a bronze statue on iron framework. 50 feet was the stone pedestal, 110 feet for the statue. It was 160 feet tall. That's when people would look at it. It was out at the harbor entrance, just like the Statue of Liberty in New York City. It was out there, this huge statue. Now, just think about the Statue of Liberty. It's 111 feet from the heel to the crown. This other statue, the Colossus of Rhodes, was 110 feet. They're almost exactly the same height, but the Statue of Liberty goes up 40 more feet up to the tip of the torch. So if you can picture it, they look almost exactly alike as far as their height. It was probably made out of 1-inch thick bronze. It weighed perhaps 300 tons. It probably had a crown of spiked rays on its head like the Statue of Liberty did, because this was Helios, the sun god. They figured that's why it had. They're not really sure. They don't have a lot of understanding of exactly what it looked like. But as I mentioned, it only stood for 56 years, and then an earthquake toppled it. But it lay in the harbor for hundreds of years. Pliny wrote, "Even as it lies, it excites our wonder and admiration. Few men can clasp the thumb in their arms." We're talking a big thumb, okay? "And its fingers are larger than most statues." It was huge. It was captured, the island of Rhodes was captured and held by Arabs from 653 AD to 658 AD. Okay, the Colossus of Rhodes has been lying on the ground, lying in the harbor this whole time, but at this point, this 5-year point in time, an Arabian general broke up the big fragments, shipped them to Syria, and sold them to a scrap metal dealer as junk. They were taken away, not they, it. The Colossus of Rhodes was taken away on the backs of 900 camels. Then it was melted down and used for lamps and trays. So much for that wonder of the world. The Temple of Artemis, or Diana, at Ephesus. Now, she was no relation to me, believe me. Acts 19, verses 23 to 41 describe one of the 7 wonders of the world. It doesn't describe all about her, but it talks about when Paul went to Ephesus and the people who were the craftsmen making these little figurines of Artemis or Diana at Ephesus, this little goddess thing. They were making all these little silver figurines. Paul's running around preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, setting people free. People are stopping, buying these figurines. And so the silversmiths get a little hot under the collar about this, and they start getting real upset and say, "Let's get rid of Paul. Let's get him out of here. Let's kill him. Let's do something." Read about it. Acts chapter 19, verses 23 to 41. Now, let's look at what this temple was. Now, a man by the name of Philon of Byzantium, who was another one that wandered all over the place, he said, "I've seen the walls and hanging gardens of ancient Babylon. I've seen the statue of the Olympian Zeus. I've seen the Colossus of Rhodes, the mighty work of the high pyramids, and the tomb of Mausolus." Now, those are all 7 ancient wonders of the world, or all part of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. He says, "But when I saw the temple at Ephesus rising to the clouds, all these other wonders were put in the shade." Panasius, too, that's another guy in that time period, wrote that this temple surpassed all other structures built by human hands. Yet the temple of Artemis at Ephesus is long gone. The goddess has no worshipers. The silversmiths ceased centuries ago to fashion images of her. Ephesus itself is a muddy, unimportant Turkish village, but the religion that Paul preached continues on. I thought that was kind of cool. So here's one where the Bible actually talks about one of the ancient wonders of the world. Where was Ephesus? Well, if you look on a map, look on the coast of Asia Minor there, across the Aegean Sea from Greece, we find this city of Ephesus. It was a Greek colony. Artemis was known as Diana to the Romans, so the Greeks called her Artemis, the Romans called her Diana. She was a mother goddess here in the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. She was different than any place else. She was considered a mother goddess, the deity of fertility, and the books that I read indicated that she was really, the way this goddess looked was from the indigenous people. Well, as I mentioned in the Hittites earlier, it's probably the Hittites who were the ones that gave the look to this goddess that she had at the Temple of Ephesus here. Now, there were several temples built on this site, but it was the one that began after the temple was destroyed in 356 BC that we remember as this ancient wonder of the world. It was built in a marshy place. Fascinating, a Roman historian who died at the time of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, Pliny, he wrote this, that it was built in a marshy place in order that it might not suffer from earthquakes or the chasms which they produce. On the other hand, this is so weird to imagine, so that the foundations of so vast a pile might not have to rest upon a loose and shifting bed, layers of charcoal were placed beneath. with fleeces covered with wool upon the top of them, and that's what the temple sat on. So charcoal and sheep wool. Okay, that's an interesting thing. The entire length of the temple was 425 feet. The width was 225 feet. There were 127 columns that were 60 feet high. Now, to give you a little comparison, the Parthenon was only 230 feet long, so about half the length. It was only 100 feet wide. It was less than half the width. And it only had 58 marble columns, and they were 34 feet high. So the temple at Artemis, or the temple at Ephesus, was absolutely like twice as big and spectacular compared to the Parthenon. And we think the Parthenon was amazing. People go and look at that all the time. Well, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was even more amazing. It took between 60 and 120 years to build. Pliny said it was 120. This is amazing. But Alexander the Great, when he came to that area, it wasn't finished being built. And he said, well, I would love to pay to finish off the building as long as you can credit it to me and say that I was the one who paid for it. And the Ephesians were going, how do we get out of this one? They finally came up with, oh, Alexander the Great, it is not fitting that one god should build a temple for another god. And he said, oh, okay. And so he didn't pay for it and he didn't finish it. In 133 BC, Ephesus joined the Roman Empire. It was no longer part of Greece. It joined the Roman Empire, and Paul was there about 57 AD. In 262 AD, the Goths, those barbarian tribes, plundered and burned Ephesus and its temple. Now, Constantine, do you remember Emperor Constantine, the one who said Christianity is okay and all of that stuff? Constantine built new buildings in the city of Ephesus, but surprise, surprise, he didn't rebuild the temple. Of course, it was a pagan temple, and he had become a Christian or allowed Christianity, so he didn't build the temple again. The temple that had been burned and destroyed and broken apart was used as a quarry, like I mentioned happened with a lot of these wonders of the world, and it kind of, pieces and bits and parts all over the place in all these different buildings. In 431 AD, they had the Council of Ephesus, which was what the Christian church, when all the leaders of all the different areas of the Christian church came together and they'd formulate doctrine, they'd decide on things. They actually had it in Ephesus. So at that point, the city was still happening, but after that, it went into decline. In the 1100s, when the Crusaders were coming through the area, they were real hot to see one of these wonders of the ancient world, but it wasn't there. There was nothing there. It was all gone. Remember, it was built in a marsh, and the marsh sort of just globbed it all back up, and it was all gone. In 1863, a man by the name of John Turtle Wood, a British archaeologist, he started looking for the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, and it took him 11 years of digging in the muck and the grime and the dirt and the mud and the swamp and all of that to find it. But in 1874, he did. He finally found the temple. He had to take 132,000 cubic yards of muck, mud, all this swamp stuff out, and it left a hole 25 foot deep, 300 feet wide, 500 feet long, and that's all that remains of the fourth seven wonder of the world.